We're also streaming, which is terrific. So welcome to those of you who are joining us remotely. My name is Ted Mitchell. I'm the president of the American Council on Education, and we're very, very excited to be co-hosting this event today with Diverse and with our colleagues at ETS. Michael Nettles is here with us from ETS, and in just a moment, he'll present the results of the work that brings us together today. And following Michael's remarks, Jamal Watson will be heading up a panel up here on stage that includes my colleague and former boss, John B. King Jr. from EdTrust, former Secretary of Education in the United States, Patricia McGuire, Trinity Washington University, my colleague Luis Soares from ACE, and Jamal will keep that unruly. Oh, and Danette Howard from the Lumina Foundation, and Jamal will keep that unruly group in shape. But before we start, just a little bit of context. I think that all of us are here because we know that college completion is an important element of America's success as an economy and as a democracy. We know that college completion lags, and we know that college completion lags in a non-random fashion. And so the data that we'll be looking at today looks at college completion and measures it against two benchmarks. A benchmark set by the federal government in the previous administration, and a benchmark set by the Lumina Foundation as it looked at its goals. And without stealing Michael's thunder, I think many of you have picked up the cheat sheet from the back table. But what's good about this is that some subgroups will indeed attain either or both of the federal benchmark goal or the Lumina benchmark goal. The problem, and it's a devastating one for an America that continues to be concerned about equity, about equality and diversity, is that the subgroups that will not attain the aspirational goals are the groups that we would predict. They are African American men, Hispanic females, American Indian and Alaskan Native males and females, and we need to redouble our efforts and our focus on those subgroups if we are not only to attain numerical goals, but the moral goals. We used to talk about this when John and I were in the department as a math problem and a moral problem. It is both. It is a math problem to get those numbers higher, and it is a moral problem because our very being as a diverse democracy depends on not just having some groups achieve high goals, but all groups achieve high goals. At ACE, that's an important priority for us. We've just finished a strategic planning process, and I'm proud to say that one of the three strategic commitments of ACE as we look out at our next 3 years is to champion equity, access, and completion, and specifically to promote public policies and institutional practices that provide affordable, high-quality post-secondary education opportunities for all and expand flexible pathways for completion through innovative learning. We've put our stake in the ground around this, and we intend to work with all of our members and all of you to increase equity, access, and completion across the board. And today's report is a clarion call for us to continue to do that work. You may have seen recently, as an expression of our commitment, a report that Luis's colleague Laurel Espinosa headed up on MSIs and the way that those institutions have really been able to show the way for the nation in working with very few resources to create opportunities and pathways to completion. And while that's not the only answer, it is an answer. And working together, I think we can make sure that whether it's in the world of policy or the world of practice, we and our colleagues are doing more every day to promote completion among subgroups who currently continue to suffer from under-resourced institutions, under-inspired leadership, and practices that are not geared toward their success. So while the bottom line of the report today is perhaps a negative one, the upside is it will help us focus on the work that we need to do and to galvanize our colleagues to do more and better. So, Michael, if I may bring you up, and we can go through the report. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Ted, for the introduction and for your perspective about the report. And I must say that it shows for sure that you've read it and in great depth, and I appreciate it. And congratulations to you on your appointment in this leadership role at ACE. I think you're still new enough for me to do that. Uh, you come on the shoulders of giants in that role, but I can't imagine that anybody's had the breadth and diversity of experiences that you've had coming into this role. So we're very hopeful about what you're going to achieve here. And Jamal Watson, I have the privilege of being, this may have been before you were born, but I had the privilege of being at the initial meeting when Frank and Bill Cox talked about establishing Black issues in higher education. It became Black issues in higher education and has evolved into diverse. And it's always wonderful to be connected with diverse, and your work has been superior in the role as editor. Thank you very much. And on behalf of ETS, I want to thank our co-sponsors and all of you. We were founded for the purpose of achieving equity in higher education in particular. And we continue to work hard to live out that mission. So on behalf of our president, Walt McDonald, and our colleagues at ETS, they want to thank you all for joining us in this event. And Ted has given an overview of some of the highlights. I'm going to go through the report. So I have basically about 5 points to make during the next 15, 20 minutes. First of all, I'm going to talk about the, let me see what's up here. Okay, all right. So what are the degree attainment goals? Just to give us, make sure we start off on the same page. And then why they matter, and how many more degrees do we really need to achieve the goals? When are we projected to achieve the goals, and what do we need to do to accelerate the progress? So just to begin, we have two sets of goals in the country. One was set by the federal government, the other by Lumina Foundation. One of the remarkable things about the last decade in government, and we found it exciting that the president announced these goals, President Obama, in 2009. But hearing Lumina Foundation come along with its own thinking about this was just remarkable. It was great to see the collaboration, so toward the recognition that we had a consensus we need to do something about a variety of things, and to see the public-private partnership here. But there are distinctions. You can see the federal government's goal is 2020. The focus is on a cohort of, or an age group of 25 to 34-year-olds. And Lumina's is different because it sets the target still at 60%, but 25 to 64-year-olds, a bigger age group, and 2025 as the target year. Now, here in the U.S., it's important to always think about states when we're thinking about things like goals and policies, because while the national government has a great influence and can set the tone for education in the country, the responsibility and authority lies with the states. And so just because we're in D.C., I could choose Virginia or Maryland as the neighbor. I chose to go with Maryland just to illustrate a few points. But one of the great things that Lumina has done over the past decade is to not only think about the national goal, but also to work with the states in establishing their own goals. And I'm not sure that 50 states have done this, but Maryland is one that has, and it's set the target at 55% of 65 to 25 to 64-year-olds achieving the goal by 2025. And this was set in 2014, just a few years after the national goals were established. So where do we start? So overall, if you think about Lumina's goal, we want to get to 60%. We are starting off at 40% for the overall population, about 46% for whites in 2014. And then in the state of Maryland, we start off at 47, 48%, closer to their 55% than the national goal. But this is one of the points that Ted Mitchell raised at the outset. Where we start is a different place for each population group. Now, on the one hand, we are one population, we are one country, but historically we come at this in different routes. So I think if I had been at the table, which is maybe one reason I wasn't, being a sort of a contrarian at the beginning, I might have raised this point. I can't imagine that I would not have suggested that while we are setting this goal, how would African Americans move from 29% to 60% by 2020, just in a decade? And there are differences also in associate and bachelor's degree. We won't get into that greater detail, but the goals are for associate and bachelor's degrees, if you're talking about the national government. And Lumina does an interesting thing. It adds in certificates, and it goes further than saying every certificate counts. It talks about meaningful certificates, which is basically half of the certificates awarded each year. And what that means is that in a general way, and Lumina may have more nuanced ways of thinking about this, but it means that if you have a certificate and are working in that field, it counts. So it's a good acknowledgement that this is that these certificates matter. And one reason that they matter is because of why the overall goals matter, and that is employment opportunities. And if you look here at the unemployment rates, for example, for the overall population at 5.5%, and then you can see differences in these population in the unemployment rates for different population groups. I'm going to single out African Americans here because it makes the starkest point on why these degrees really matter. You can see that the overall rate for African Americans was 11%. For people who complete high school, it's about 15% unemployment. But if you have a bachelor's degree, your chances are greater. The employment rate goes down to 4.5%. Now, these are overgeneral sort of comments about employment. We know that there are complexities to these numbers. So, for example, are these jobs equal in the economy? We have a sense that they're not. Is upward mobility the same for people of these different race groups? So we've got a complex set of issues to solve. But I think one of the benefits of these goals is that they at least get us into the conversation, and these large numbers make a difference. Now, and employment is not just the only reason, but this is just one reason that President Obama and Lumina Foundation have stated as the purpose of these goals. Now, what will it take to reach the goals? This is a busy table, but basically, if we're talking about the federal government from 2014 to 2020, it would take about 54% increase in associate's and bachelor's degrees to get to the goal. When you see that kind of number and you know this field, you have to step back and say, well, why did they set the goal at 60% if we know it's that big of a job? And I think the purpose is that, and President Obama actually said it. He said that, if you don't set this goal, people won't really take it seriously if you don't establish a time frame. So this is important. If you take a look at Lumina's goal, is similar, about a 55% increase needed in order to reach the goal. Now that's overall, but if you go down to the African American population, 125% increase for the overall population, 173% increase for African American men. Even Native Americans, a 200% increase by 2025. Asian Americans have already attained the goal, which is another storyline here. The Asian American population would tell us in response that the job is not completed, even though we're showing these goals, and there are variations by ethnic groups within the Asian population. But the good news is that if we look at this overarching goal, Asian Americans have actually accomplished it. A 344% increase needed for Hispanic men, over 200% for Hispanics overall. White women are likely to achieve the federal goal by next year. And the Lumina goal a little bit later than 2025. I'll come back to that point. State of Maryland has a similar set of stories, although the African American population looks much closer to the Maryland state goal than the African American population looks to the national goal. Now, when will we get there? So, again, I want to thank John King, Danette Howard, and Patricia McGuire, and Louis Soros for being respondents to this. And Ted, I think if we were to think about bringing this group back together in 2041, we might be able to have some champagne. There would be a celebration about reaching the national goal of 60% by 2041 for the federal government. A little bit later, 2042 for whites, in 2042 for Lumina's goal. Now, I'm 62, and I'm counting to 2060. So if we have this party in 2060, we still wouldn't be able to celebrate African Americans, American Indians, and Hispanics achieving this goal. So I'm asking my colleagues to stay tuned, because I think the most important part of this is what do we need to do about it, right? This is just not acceptable to think that we're going to be having these goals and these population groups not achieve them by 2060, okay? So, now, what is important also in this conversation is that we widen it to the states, not just the state of Maryland, but we're using Labor Department projections when it comes to the states. And if I were in the federal government, because this is totally nonpartisan, but in times when you're trying to get the states to, come out to do common activities around this, what we've learned is that the labor departments in each state, if they're setting projections, are doing them using different methodologies and different time frames. New Jersey may go up to 2040. Nobody goes up as high as the federal government. And the reason we stopped projections at 2060 is because that's the latest year that the U.S. Census Bureau makes its projections. But what this basically shows you, if you look at the red line, and all of these graphs will be available to you, is that in the state of Maryland at the moment, the younger cohort is trailing in degree attainment rates. The cohort just above it, the 25 to 34-year-olds, are not keeping pace with the degree attainment rates of 35 to 44-year-olds. And what that means is that if Maryland is going to make progress in achieving the goal, then it has to think about that younger cohort increasing the rates, especially if you look at the African American difference, the 5.1% difference. That gap is significant and will cause increase in attainment rate gaps if something's not done to address that problem in the state of Maryland. Here we also see that the country is moving faster than the state of Maryland toward degree attainment. And if you look at these population groups, you can see that these population groups are moving at different paces. The bottom line here is Hispanics, and the wobble in the bottom line is something that also should concern people in the state of Maryland about the Hispanic population. It suggests that Hispanic population is growing in Maryland, but the recent people who are moving to the state are attaining degrees at a lower pace among Hispanics than their predecessors. So these are sort of the state policy issues that have to be addressed state by state. Now, this is just the ratio of degree attainment to population increase for the age group of 25 to 64-year-olds. And basically what it says is that for every population group, the good news is that degree attainment is growing faster than population. The unsettling news, the sort of the bad news, is that it's not growing fast enough for any population group. The white population is actually declining in representation in the country, but also in real numbers for this population group. And the degree attainment rates are increasing, but for these other population groups, they need the proportion of degrees to population need to grow much faster than they have. So what can we do? With the data that we have, we know that there are 36 million people in the country who have some college with no degree. Some would call that low-hanging fruit. Okay, so the question is, what proportion of that population can we attract back into post-secondary education? How do you pay for it? And we have some ideas about that, but this is an interesting number overall, and proportionally African Americans and these other population groups are a higher proportion of that population than they are of the overall population. So there's overrepresentation of dropouts for these underrepresented groups. 35% of the population of four-year colleges are not graduating with a degree. Somehow we get episodes of intensity about this in post-secondary education. There's the Complete College America initiative, of course, and other initiatives, but we sometimes hear about the level of intensity that we need in order to increase the graduation rates than we are at other times. And then a higher percent of high school graduates, 2/3 of people, are actually entering 2- and 4-year colleges and universities after high school graduation immediately. And the question is, how do we get more of them to complete? And this, of course, differs by race and ethnic group as well. One of the challenges that we face with that population is that we need to raise the level of preparation to match the high expectations of these high school students. You know, 3/4 are telling us that they want to go to college. Half of that population telling us that they expect to attain a degree and actually go on to post-baccalaureate education. But preparing that population to do that is another issue. Now here's one that I think is really important for us to pay some attention to. And people have different levels of concentration about this and belief. And it basically suggests that we need to find a way to fund colleges and universities that are serving underrepresented populations. And in particular, strengthening the faculty. In particular, this is not to say that large research universities, even private elite institutions, are not committed to this, and they may not need the funding. Maybe they need more of a different kind of push. But there are over 26% of the nation's undergraduate students, not just minority undergraduate students, attending institutions that are minority serving institutions, as an example. I mean, this is a growing population in the country. And when you talk to people about that population of institutions, they have various levels of knowledge about them, and not the level of commitment that we need to strengthening their faculty, to providing the students with scholarships, and to building the infrastructure of those institutions to support growth toward attaining these goals. Now, this is the first of three. My colleagues at ETS who work with me on a regular basis have chided me about the work that and the level of time that we're taking to do this. You can tell that this first report has every number in it 50 million times, and we try to clean every datum in there so that it's accurate. We're doing the same thing with these other reports. The second one requires some imputation of that we are trying to be very careful with, but my colleagues affectionately call this trilogy. And so the second report we anticipate coming out later this year. I would, if Catherine Millett wasn't here, I'd give a date. But she called me on it, so and asked me to explain why I gave you that date, but the target date. But hopefully later this year, we're getting close, and then it's focused on the preparation, and not just the academic preparation, but the financial preparation and the social preparation for college. And there are some surprises in here when we disaggregate the data by race, and we do this also by gender. And then the third report will focus much more on the 3 decades of trends in the country and the completion rates of students from college. So with that, I want to thank you again, Ted, for hosting us here, and thank you, Patricia, and John, and Louis, and Danette for joining me in this conversation. And I appreciate the interaction that we can have with people here today, but also ongoing, because this is not just a report for us. It is really a commitment to try to do something to elevate not just the dialogue, but the activity around trying to accomplish the closing of these gaps in achievement and attainment in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nettles, and good afternoon. My name is Jamal Watson, and I'm the executive editor of Diverse Issues in Higher Education magazine. Certainly, Dr. Nettles has left us with some challenges, right? But with every challenge, there's also opportunities, and so we're really fortunate for his leadership and the leadership at ETS for giving us this data and for allowing a dialogue to take place. I'm interested in, first let me just briefly introduce our panelists. Most of them don't need an introduction, but we have all the way to my far right, President Patricia McGuire, who's the president of Trinity Washington University. Let's welcome her. We have John King Jr., who many of us know as the former Secretary of Education, and also he is the president of Education Trust. Let's welcome him. Luis Suarez, who is the Senior Vice President, and I'm going to mess up your title, I'm sorry, of Research, Policy, and Advancement. There we are. Okay, let's welcome him. Michael Nettles, who is the Senior Vice President at ETS. And of course, we have Dr. Danette Howard, who is a Senior Vice President at Lumina Foundation as well. So I want to start off with Dr. Nettles has said when this report came out that we needed to focus on targeted and tailored strategies for dealing with underrepresented groups. And I wanted to first just pose out a generic question to all of the panelists. Are you surprised by the data? Is there anything that shocked you coming out of this report? Is anyone shocked? No. Okay. Not in the least. All right. Anyone else? No. So the question for me is, how do we get to the targeted and tailored strategies that Dr. Nettles initially outlined in terms of where do we go from here? Anybody have any suggestions? Dr. King, you want to start?
Sure. Well, first, I think acknowledging the problem is the first step to solving it. And unless we are comfortable as a country talking about racial gaps in college attainment, we aren't having an honest conversation. So if we just talk in generalities, we're not going to get to a solution. That said, once you have named the problem, then I think we have to ask what's getting in the way for so many students of color. And I think there are nuances, there are certainly nuanced differences between Latino students and African American students, even within the population of Latino students. But it's worth saying, we essentially give the students who need the most the least at every level of our system. So low-income students and students of color are less likely to get quality pre-K. They are less likely to get assigned to effective teachers. They are less likely to get a well-rounded K through 12 education that includes art and science and social studies along with English and math. They are less likely to get access to advanced coursework. They are less likely to have school counselors in their school. They are less likely to get the support they need to make the transition to post-secondary. And then, because we're in this building, it's worth saying that in the post-secondary system, we replicate the stratification of opportunity that you see in K-12. So students of color are disproportionately going to institutions that are systematically under-resourced, whether that's minority-serving institutions or particularly our public higher ed institutions, including our community colleges. So if you make it through that funnel and get to college, you're then getting to a campus where there's less support than you would need to graduate. That's part of why we have, as Michael pointed out, 36 million Americans with some credits and no degree, because we aren't necessarily investing in the support and the financial assistance that students need once they get to college to actually finish.
How does this look at your institution?
If I could just jump right in there, because Trinity is a minority-serving institution, a predominantly black institution, certainly one of the more under-resourced institutions in America, but we do a great job with our students. And I think the American Council on Education report that came out last week really underscored the fact that MSIs do a good job with their students, and this pitting of higher ed institutions against each other, the rich and the not so rich, is not really where the problem is. We work with a deeply impoverished population. Our student body at Trinity is 85% Pell Grants. And one of the things that I noticed was not a word used in the very fine report that Michael did, and I really appreciate this, but I didn't see the word poverty anywhere. And John, you just listed all of the conditions of poverty. We cannot underestimate the impact of poverty starting at the earliest age through to the readiness and ability of children to learn in college and to attain the degrees. The students frequently stop out, not because we're not providing support or not because we're not rich, but because there are siblings at home who need the student to go to work and help support, or there's a baby in the family, or the student's living in the back of the car, or she wants to be a nurse and she gets into the first semester courses in nursing and discovers that she doesn't have any of the academic platform. And in fact, she's not going to finish in 6 years, and she's going to run out of financial aid. So instead of going to the registrar's office to change her major, she just stops showing up. The discouragement that students feel in the first year of college who have been underserved in the previous 12 years of education is one of the largest causes of the completion rate gap, and I think that needs a lot more study, actually, because what we see are discouraged African American students in particular who really want the degrees, but who don't have the skill set to get there.
And although the Lumina goal was the focus of the analysis of the report, I really appreciated the highlight on what it's going to take to get to our goal. And I think that many, many more people need to understand who today's students are. And I think that you heard the other panelists say that. I'm in too many rooms where people talk about the kids going to college, thinking that folks going to college are still primarily directly from high school and 18 to 22 years old. And I have to start many of my conversations by saying most students are not being supported by their parents. Most students are not living on a 4-year residential campus. Many students are working sometimes more than one job, in fact, many times more than one job to support themselves through school. And in fact, many have children of their own. So let's start there. And when the individuals in the decision-making positions have that mindset that these students are individuals who are being supported by someone else, then that kind of is where the problem begins and needs to be addressed. So once we start with that baseline, I think that we can discuss some pathways. And some pathways that I'm really interested in discussing are how some of these institutions, like the ones that were just described, can develop some partnerships, real partnerships with employers, such that employers are able to develop smartly designed options for students who have to work while they are pursuing that credential that they know they need to get. So it's not like we have to create a value proposition for these students. We have to help them understand that this is going to make a difference in their lives. They know that. They have to get some assistance with navigating their way beyond and through those obstacles. And I think that starting with those employer pathways, like the one that was announced by Walmart, and we did help to kind of develop that, is one way to start.
And Dr. Nettleson mentioned some of the work that was taking place on the state level. You were Secretary of Education in Maryland, and I was just wondering, what was the thinking on the state level at the time in terms of how you all were going to do that on the statewide level?
So I was Secretary of Higher Ed in Maryland when that goal was developed. Thank you so much for picking Maryland and not Virginia, because I have a little bit to say about Maryland. And one of my former commissioners is in the audience. We actually developed that goal back in late 2010 or 2011, I believe. And we knew that in order for our state to not just remain competitive, but to become more competitive, we had to address those long-standing and pervasive gaps that existed by race and ethnicity in our state. And we had to develop ways for more students of color, more underrepresented students of color, to get those credentials that they needed, that they were going to need in order to be competitive. And so that was really the impetus for our goal. And I have to say that if we were going back to 2010 or 11, I think we would have developed a more ambitious goal. I think that 55% is actually too low, certainly too low for a state like Maryland, and that we're seeing now states developing goals that are about 70%, 65%. And so we want, as Lumina is working with states, and there are now 42 states with goals, we are really challenging them to develop robust stretch goals that are codified some way, either in law or a state plan, because we think having that goal is the beginning to getting real work done toward making real change.
Mr. Suarez, how do we build on the pathways, the partnerships that Dr. Howard talked about?
So, the comments that are coming to mind are from two bodies of work that we've done here. One was a case study on the use of data in solving for equity issues in the PASHE system in Pennsylvania with Alicia Dowd. Another was a report we did on university business models. And there are two kind of streams of thought there, I think. One that's within the institution, and then one that extends beyond the institution and how it begins to understand the pipelines that Michael mentions, right? So Inside the institution, as data is coalescing to have institutions actually understand their population and manage it as executive teams, you're starting to have this thing happen that executive teams more or less functioned at the level of the institution. Data that's actually on both the program outcome side and the financial side are starting to coalesce so that you can begin to manage to certain outcomes, create teams that are actually really teams. Pat does this on our campus. And so that's beginning to take place. The avatars of that are things like Georgia State University, more in a more extensive way, the University Innovation Alliance. The important thing there is how, as executive teams, you're actually being able to move your campuses towards exacting goals. But the interesting thing, in all of those cases, or in many of them, part of what happens next is that once you start using data and you think you're moving the needle on equity issues internally, you start looking outside and how you can understand the pipelines more deeply. Two examples there would be that Georgia State is doing this, and so is ASU, another leader in the University Innovation Alliance. As they started mastering the ability to move organizational resources using data internally, they started trying to use data to connect to community colleges and K-12 systems in Arizona and Georgia as well. The other example I'll use, which is unrelated, to use another one, is the relationship between University of Central Florida and Valencia College in Florida, which now they're trying to extend to the feeding K-12 systems as well. The reason that's noteworthy is because that visibility to the pipeline, if you're starting to have an executive management team and an internal culture that can actually move towards more equitable goals, your ability to look at your pipeline with the same results is part of what's going to help you move the number for the generations coming up. And I would argue that until fairly recently, that ability to understand the pipeline, not just as general demographic data, but more as a data point that you can use for management purposes, is fairly new in higher ed.
President McGuire talked about the role that poverty certainly plays, and I want to ask you, Dr. Nettles, can you elaborate or talk a little bit about that role and how that factors into this conversation we're having?
Yeah, it's a pervasive issue, and she's exactly right. So we've been trying to address that at the post-secondary level, and I had a few minutes to talk with President McGuire prior to the session. So we've been working on things like sustainable funding models for students who are about to enter post-secondary education, recognizing that funding is one of the big contributors to dropout rates. And it's not just, as Patricia said, it's not just being able to have enough money in the bank, but it's also having the responsibilities for family members. So that's the college level. And so I would suggest that we attack that as one part of the problem, given that we are focused on higher education, and try to think about ways to reform federal student financial aid so that it's not just increasing the amount of money in Pell Grants, which we spend an enormous amount of time trying to do, and what the result is always incremental increases in the Pell Grants that sort of lose ground relative to the increase in price. So we've got to attack that problem at the collegiate level. What I think President McGuire has suggested, though, is a problem that higher education may be best equipped to address in the country, and maybe we haven't given enough attention to it, which is how do you increase the quality of communities? I mean, everybody, regardless of what we do, we're going to have a lower quartile, right? Some people are going to wind up being relatively poor. Now, but in a country with the vast resources that we have to be able to address this problem. And I think in a rational sort of way, what we need is strategies for helping to increase the quality of schools in poor communities, trying to find ways to get the best teachers to go to the poorest schools. What kind of policies do we need to do that? What kind of policies do we need to build new school buildings in places where you can't get the bond issues, you can't get the tax? Well, one way that we've done it in New Jersey is through the courts. Now, I don't suggest that's the solution in every place, but we ought to learn from the Abbott case in New Jersey what happened. The courts ruled that you have to give, the state has to make sure that the 32 poorest districts in the state have as much money to spend as the richest districts, not just in operational costs, but also in capital improvements. And we're seeing that play out in the Abbott case. And we also see that, there's high quality pre-K as a consequence of it, new standards for pre-K. So we've got to take those lessons. And I think colleges and universities, particularly research institutions that have poverty centers, like Michigan, for example, need to be part of the education solution as well for these communities. So I think we have not just, I think we're best equipped in higher education to come up with these solutions. What we've got to do is we've got to be willing to do it. We've got to make this a priority in places like ACE, where we say, higher education is going to take on the issue of poverty in the country, and we're going to do something about it.
I think where Michael leaves off is right, that we've got to be much more bold. If you think about what Michael laid out as the percentage increases that are needed, right? You're talking about 200, 300% increases. Those aren't incremental, nibble at the edges problems, right? Those require bold solutions. So 3 things that one might start with. We know from the research that Sarah Goldrick-Robb has done how many students, particularly on community college campuses, are food and housing insecure. Why don't we have a free and reduced price lunch program for higher education like we do in K-12, right? We know it's hard.
Cards too.
Exactly. So here's a second. There's a program at City University of New York called CUNY ASAP. As part of CUNY ASAP, you get Metro cards. Yep. You also get emergency grants. If there's a financial obstacle to staying in school, you get intensive advising, similar to what Georgia State is doing, even going further with a cohort model. It's more expensive, but it's not more expensive on a per graduate basis. So why don't we make CUNY ASAP, which we know is doubling completion rates in community colleges at CUNY and is showing early signs of doing something very similar in Ohio, community colleges there. Let's make that available on all of our community college campuses, right? If we're going to hit these goals, we have to think much bigger. And then the third point I would say is, Danette talked about the work in Maryland, and I think one of the realities that we've seen play out in Maryland is once you set the goals, if you have leadership that is unwilling to invest in public higher education, you are not going to get to those goals. And so we found enough money to invest in trillions of dollars of tax cuts for the top 1% of Americans. In fact, an unbelievable amount of money to invest in that. Couldn't we find a similar amount of money, maybe we take those away, and put that investment into public higher ed, which is the greatest engine of social mobility we have as a country?
So if I could just expand on this a little bit, because all of this is right. We're doing another initiative at Trinity, or trying to at least, to address some of the K-12 issue in a slightly different way. The District of Columbia has one of the highest per capita spending rates of any school system in the country, and the results are still pretty dismal, actually. And you saw the recent scandal in DC where, a third of students who graduated hadn't been in school for a long time. We see that coming into college, because then they don't think they have to go to class in college and are shocked when they find out they have to go to school. So one of the things we've been working on with DC Public Schools, and it hasn't come to full fruition yet, is getting into early college and dual enrollment models so that we actually get into the schools. And we specifically are trying to focus on STEM and nursing. Because one of the things that relates to all of this, and Michael, your report had a great section at the end with the buckets of occupations and the different jobs within it. there's a huge disconnect between what the students really want to do and what they're plunged into learning. And they're not prepared for some of the career tracks that are listed there. And I keep using nursing as the best example. I mean, we have a great nursing program at Trinity, but we have so many students who want nursing who don't know that it requires math and science. There's something wrong at middle school or earlier that the students are not prepared for those tracks. It's not just that they can't do the work, they don't even know that the work is required. And we believe that if we could start working with the schools in a true dual enrollment fashion and even an early college model, we could help set up what are some of the pathways for some of the professional degrees that we offer in a way that would make more sense for the students, so it really builds a bridge. The other thing we're doing with faculty, and we're trying to get some traction around, there's a model that Yale has, the Yale National Initiative, in which college faculty are paired with high school teachers in select school systems. Again, especially in the STEM disciplines, it makes a great deal of sense. So putting our collegiate people into the schools, having the schools come to our campus, working in a true cross-sectional model, I think is one of the ways we could solve this problem. But it's not inexpensive.
But it's that partnership that you talked about. Dr. Howard, you want to?
Yes. I wanted to offer a here to something that John said, and then, if I may, a friendly amendment. And that is to the example you provided regarding CUNY ASAP, which I think is fantastic. Lumina Foundation has supported CUNY ASAP for many years. But I think institutions and post-secondary systems need to be sure that their student success efforts and their fiscal and operational efforts don't unintentionally work at cross purposes. So something that we found out, and we were very surprised by, or at least I was that CUNY, which is a very large system with its credit and non-credit offerings, has over 500,000 students enrolled, actually has several tens of thousands of students each year who find themselves on some sort of financial probation, meaning that they have fees or fines that they've accumulated. Sometimes they are relatively small, library fines, parking fines, late fines. And if they aren't able to satisfy those fines in, let's say, a semester or a year, they then go into default, right? So we have started to do some analysis which showed that all of the students who are in that category could have those fines resolved for a total of about $1.2 million. However, many of those students don't have their fines resolved and instead are sent to collections. So what happens when a poor student isn't able to resolve or satisfy a fine, which is on average about $500, and then gets sent to collections? What does that do to that entire individual's life? Right? It spirals in some ways downward. And when we talk about poverty and an individual that is trying to lift him or herself out of poverty, what happens when that opportunity that they thought was going to help do that actually spirals them down further? So sometimes the fiscal side of the house and the student success sides of the house are working at cross purposes, and I think we have to do more to make sure that that doesn't happen and that students don't get stuck in the crosshairs, because sometimes we're lifting the very same institutions up that are unintentionally not serving students well on the financial side.
Can you give that speech at Nakubo to the chief financial officers?
Actually, we're meeting with a group of chief financial officers tomorrow. I don't know if they'd invite me, but I'd love to be able to say that.
But I think that is really important in terms of
Very
how
important.
institutions need to be talking to each other.
Yep.
And the ROI, if those students graduated, I mean, it would more than pay for itself.
That's right.
But I just want to add that what it suggests, though, is it's easiest right now to keep the student right when you identify the challenge, and that's good. The data systems and the practices have not evolved enough yet, so that if you discover that 3 months out, right? So the person now is in default. No system is perfect. And if you can keep the student at that point, that's the best time. But how do you recover the student in a 3 to 6 month window? We don't have the systems and the practice yet to do that. And our reality is that we will, some of them will do that, because life happens, especially to the least traditional students. And so if we want to get to the scale numbers that you mentioned, John, there's the front end of it, which is resourcing institutions appropriately. For example, states not defunding us.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this other piece of acknowledging that, you know, even if the system is operating optimally, there's still going to be folks that fall out for all kinds of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we optimize our ability to re-engage them in a way that's affordable and can reconnect them? Because, you know, they're discovering that at Georgia State with some of the
Absolutely.
Panther grants,
Mhm.
where when they can catch the student at the moment, that's the best time to continue the journey. But they're starting to realize that for all kinds of really good reasons, like, you know, life happens and death in the family and all that, you have to try to re-engage that student later. And the systems don't really exist yet to do that well.
I'm curious to know what impact the free community college movement or drive is having on any of these, may have on any of this attainment numbers as well. Anybody have any thoughts on that piece?
I think the honest answer is it may help and it may
May
do
not.
nothing at
Yep.
all.
Exactly.
And a lot depends on the policy design. And we just did a report last week on essentially building on Michael's work in many ways, looking at state level attainment gaps for African American and Latino students. And undoubtedly in some of those states, people will respond by saying, I know the solution is we'll make community college in our state free. But if what that means is a last dollar program targeted largely at affluent students, because low-income students are getting tuition covered often by Pell Grants or state-level support, all you're doing is a small budget increment for affluent students. And there are some states that describes exactly their program. It's not very expensive because there aren't that many affluent students in their community colleges, and so they say, well, we'll subsidize them. That's not really changing this dynamic. To change this dynamic, you'd have to say, we're going to invest in the students who are most vulnerable, low-income students, first-gen students. We're going to invest in institutional supports. We're going to lower barriers like access to childcare or access to food and housing, right? That's what it would take to really deliver on the word promise, right? But unfortunately, you know, what governors know is you get the headline either way. Right? So the inexpensive affluent student targeting program gets you the same headline as the expensive actual attainment moving program. And so we've got to make sure somehow we shift the politics so there's pressure to make promise programs real.
Mm-hmm. And if I could follow up on that, I agree with everything John just said. At Trinity, more than half of our DC residents pay no tuition. We subsidize tuition quite heavily. The idea of free community college, while it sounds great and it's a great political platform, in fact, many students do get free college in different ways, but that doesn't change their ability to pay the total cost of attendance and all related costs in college. So we have students who can't buy textbooks. We've gone to open source materials to try to reduce that. We have students who are used to getting Metro cards in high school and then suddenly can't afford the $10 or $15 a week on the Metro system and the unreliable Metro system, or they just cannot figure out how to do their child care and their job and their calculus homework, all of which have attendant costs. Or they're also, a lot of 20 to 25-year-olds are also supporting siblings and even elder family members. We don't have a good map of what the financial obligations are of younger students who are independent and trying to go to college and trying to do everything else. Lumen has done a good deal of work on this, but the cost of college is far more than tuition. We've worked also with a lot of private benefactors, because this is an area where private benefactors like the Gates Foundation and others, 5 years or 10 years ago, Gates came into DC and put a lot of money into scholarships in Ward 7 and 8. Hooray for that, that is terrific. But the assumption was that if we put money into tuition scholarships, all the students will go to college and succeed. And they were disappointed to discover that the students did not complete college and succeed, because the scholarships were only removing a tuition cost that wasn't real in the student's mind to begin with, because the students have always been in free education. They don't know that there's a cost that's now being subsidized. It does nothing to change behaviors or to change the empowerment of the student's personal life and all of the conditions. So we need to look at the cost issues and the financial support issues in a much broader way than just the cost of tuition. I think Sarah Goldrick-Robb is getting at that in a big way. She's a major advocate for free community college. Bravo to her. And I love the work she's done on hunger and homelessness and all the rest of this. I think we all need to take a clearer look at her work and also what we understand are the financial barriers for student success in college, because they are enormous and they're not the ones that appear on the bill.
Right.
I want to open it up to some questions, but before I do, Dr. Nettles, when we think about these conversations that we need to have, and it seems to me we need to bring different stakeholders into the conversation, where do you imagine that starting? I mean, who are the stakeholders that should be part of this discussion? When should we be having this discussion? It seems like we need to have it at a much earlier
Students.
level. Yeah, absolutely.
Students need to be in these discussions, and frequently they're not even asked to participate.
Okay.
No. Go ahead, Michael. No, you go. No, so last week I was at an EduVentures conference, and Carol D'Amico from the Strata Education Network was doing a presentation. As folks know, they're doing a lot of work with Gallup now. And Strata was talking a lot of, Strata is really focusing a lot on the idea of the higher ed student as a consumer, and really in the traditional customer sense. And I've written about that myself over the years, but one of the things that's missing from that is college, like any service, the value is co-created. If you lack agency of any kind, you can't actually. And I think that Strata is helping us in a lot of ways to frame a meta-level set narrative about what consumers think. But this issue of agency and how, especially what I would call post-traditional students, are involved in the actual dialogue about stuff that actually is one of our biggest challenges. Mm-hmm. And for me, it straddles this. When you speak of agency, so before I came here, I was at the Center for American Progress. And one of the challenges there in introducing the language of customer and agency is that on the left of the political conversation, often, if you talk about agency too much, you end up placing all the responsibility for the results on the individual, as opposed to some of the institutions that are not supporting the service. And I think that learner agency is absolutely critical. And balancing the political dialogue about how you get there while having dual responsibility is one of our key challenges in engaging other stakeholders while engaging the learners. Sorry, I want to say that because I think it's so critical. I started doing this work teaching English to undocumented people in Rhode Island, where I'm from. And I try to build a bridge program to my community college from that. And, it was the agency of those students embodied in their local union, because most of them, when they could get work, were working. The union helped me to make them visible. Mm-hmm. And that their agency was embodied there. And it's absolutely critical. And so I just want to say, hearken that, please, Michael.
Yeah, no, I think Patricia made a point earlier in her remarks about so this idea of pitting institutions across the spectrum against each other. And I think this is a topic where we could actually find some unanimity about at least the objective, and now the process then should engage everybody. So I would suggest that we think about it top to bottom. I'm amazed at how many rooms I'm in sometimes, and in many more that I'm not in which there's a lack of diversity at the top. That's something that really needs to change if we're going to have solutions for people where the diversity of the population comes from, right? Mm-hmm. Because I came from the background that I came from, I'm constantly looking back to try to figure it out. And I know that that's not the perspective of many of my colleagues. And it shouldn't necessarily be. I don't blame them. I mean, but we can't just ask for it. We got to insist on it. I mean, there has to be this consistent focus on, we hire consulting firms And I'm amazed that I look at and I'm thinking, okay, where is the diversity in this group? There are other minds that need to think in a broader way. Sometimes I go to Urban League meetings where there's a lot of innovative work going on, a lot of progressive thinking about things like elementary and secondary education, post-secondary education. In fact, they're hosting and having a meeting tomorrow. And the people who I met with last week aren't even paying attention. These are two different worlds. And somehow we've got to try to figure out how to get our worlds together on this topic.
This is a great story. We had a convening here, I think, last September, and it was on data use on college campuses, and it was a variety of folks. There were some presidents, IR folks, and we also invited. We were doing some work with Alicia Dowd at the time, so we invited some equity researchers, and it was fascinating because there was these two conversations happening. One was the data folks that think they're solving equity issues, and then the researchers that have been doing equity research for a long time that are like, I don't know what you're smoking, but I don't think you're solving equity issues. And then that's what led to the paper by Alicia Dowd on the PASHE system that we did. And essentially, she looked at 15 colleges in the PASHE system that implemented the equity scorecard that Stella Ben-Simone developed at USC. And one of the fascinating things there was you could see differences by how much equity existed on the team of their ability to move an equity initiative through their campus. And it's not something that you necessarily would have heard the other data folks talking about, but it's like, is there enough equity in the folks that are being asked to have this discussion to then lead the culture change at our institution? And then finally, we're doing a redesign of the leadership programs here at ACE. And one of the primary drivers of it, we did a focus group of MSI provosts and deans. And if folks recall, most of ACE's executive ed programs had been individual focused. And the MSI leaders that came to those focus groups essentially said to us, look, it's great for me to come to one of your sessions and learn. I need to have allies back on my campus to drive the change. We need you to engage us more at the campus level, teams of folks, get us to have an equity-minded approach to all the work that we do. And that'll help us more. And so it's not interesting, it occurred to me while you were saying that as a member organization, we're hearing that from our members, that we need different kinds of help. We need to change our mindset. We need to diversify our mindset to get where we all want to go.
That's absolutely important. Let's open it up for questions. Yes. Very loud, please.
It also applies at the state level. I'm Maureen Clement from the Council for Opportunity Education, and we recently released a report on indicators of opportunity in higher education, and the data at the state level on opportunity is limited, but it shows that they have shown there's as much diversity at the state level as there is among the there's a lot of diversity in our states in terms of equity, in terms of income. And yet we very rarely have that conversation as to how to build political will to increase opportunity at the state level.
Who wants to?
Is kind of high in terms of what would the panel suggest that we do to increase public will to increase opportunity at the state level?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but it's a very tough issue. Let me just give you two examples. We have examined achievement gaps, as you know, Maureen, over the past 15 years at ETS. And we've had different forums, different people writing papers, some from outside, some from in. In New Jersey, we had a gentleman at Rutgers, Newark, who did some data mining with state level data that were made available to us. Now, the state didn't make all of the data that we needed available, but we took what they gave us. And one of the two findings from the analysis was that people who could afford to get out of the system did very often. I mean, not everybody, but many people did. And another thing that we found is that diversity of high schools and elementary schools was the biggest contributor to closing gaps. Okay, so if you could get these school districts to become much more diverse, then you got a chance of closing gaps, because the kids who are disadvantaged are getting access to more of the best that's being offered in the system, right? So, all right, now you take that and you say, okay, let's go to the state level and say that diversity matters. Well, there are people who can opt out of it regardless, you know, so you don't get everybody participating. It's a complex social issue for, you know, who wants to be involved in state systems. Another thing that you've got going is that there is complexity in the country on the definition of diversity that matters. Okay, so my report, for example, emphasizes race and sex as the issues, you know, like gender and race, ethnic. Well, there are other people who would suggest there are other kinds of diversity that get a priority over that, you know. So, and then the comparison of the U.S. perspective, as you were doing, with international perspective. I gave a paper at the Central European University on this topic and another recently in Hungary, in Budapest. And one of the questions that people raised of me was, well, in Europe, we don't really think about race differences in this way. And in fact, when we have done analysis abroad, when we use race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status here, it's hard to find the numbers abroad that are comparable. So we wind up using zip codes, for example, to begin to estimate where people are. So it's a whole set of complex issues. Now, I know your question was about, you know, the state level diversity that we have, and what you're looking for, I think, is more diversity.
No, what I'm looking for is how do you create the political will at the state level? The solution is not, I'm not saying there's not federal elements to it.
Sure. Yeah.
But since higher education is
Very state focused.
in large part a federal, a state responsibility, if you don't create public awareness of the issues at the state level.
So the
I have-
question is, how do you do it on the state
I have
level?
a
Yeah.
couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think that from the very beginning, you have to think about sustainability related to any efforts that are put in place. Because a governor can come in and be very committed to post-secondary attainment, to equity. He can have a very diverse cabinet. He or she can have a very diverse cabinet that believes in these things and drives the issues forward. But if there is a change in the administration, that commitment might go away with the new administration. So what efforts are you going to put in place to embed that commitment such that if there is turnover, the commitment remains? Are you going to codify this in statute? Are you going to make sure that the commitment doesn't just reside within the cabinet, but is that the campuses buy into it, that the presidents take it on and believe in it, that there is shared ownership? I think that that's vitally important, such that even if there is a change in party, the work continues on because enough people believe in it and feel as if they have a part in it as well. Secondly, I think, and I've learned this just recently, that having a statewide advocacy organization that can carry the message regardless of who's in leadership is also incredibly important. So in Tennessee, there's an organization that's called Tennessee SCORE or SCORES. And they have been really important in helping to make Tennessee really a leading state in terms of post-secondary attainment, but also having a commitment to equity as it relates to increasing post-secondary attainment. And so most states don't have an equivalent to Tennessee's score, but when the governor changes and when the SHIO changes, Tennessee's score is still there saying, this is important. K-12 and higher ed, you have to work together. Let's keep our eyes on the prize. What's happening to our students? Students that don't go on to post-secondary attainment are only making $9,000 a year after they graduate from high school. What are we doing about that? We're not okay with that as a state. And so I think that those two things are something that we can all think about, how we replicate in other states.
I would just add one quick point to Danette's comment. In the cases that she pointed out, one observation I've made is that the resources tend to go to the places that are not going to increase the diversity. So SCORE is an example. For example, it has the resources. It will invite the Urban League directors to be on the board and advising it. But if over time, the Urban League and the other players that are disadvantaged populations in the community don't get the resources, then that effort won't be sustained. So what we've got to do is to figure out what makes the institutions that are over time been disadvantaged economically, how to build them up, enrich them, so to speak, and then to sustain their capacity to participate.
I want to add one thing about Tennessee and in particular Connecticut. So Tennessee really came to the national scene, 5-6 years ago, for putting in place a performance-based funding system that was supposed to really be a game changer. And in fact, it has materially moved the needle there. We did a case study a little while ago because part of the Tennessee performance-based funding system was a change to the way they did remedial education. And about the same time, Connecticut did something in the way they changed remedial education. One difference in terms of good policy, because good policy is also a good idea when it comes to sustainability. And the Tennessee system actually moved the needle while having a fiscal model that made sense for the institutions. Connecticut basically blew up the entire financial incentive structure. And so good policy is also sustainable under its own weight. And you have to be careful that if you're leading change and want to lead change, whether you're Tennessee SCORE or a given governor, that the pieces you leave behind actually make rational sense while making the change that you want to do. Because in the case of Tennessee, that they've continued to build on that in different governors. The Board of Regents, there's been different innovation based on the remedial model. In Connecticut, they're still figuring out the mess that they created from a policy perspective.
We have 2 microphones on each side. If you have a question, please go to the microphone. We're live streaming, so we want to make sure that everyone hears your question. So we'll have time for about 4 or 5 questions. So.
Well, thank you very much. This panel has been really excellent and very, very interesting. I'd like to refer back to a point that Danette made early on in the conversation about adult learners and post-traditional learners, or whatever your favorite expression is, and the fact that in many rooms one is still hearing about the traditional student who's 18 to 22 years old, but nevertheless, we need to face the reality of the fact that many of our students today, in a growing percentage, are adult learners who have to support families and have to hold other responsibilities in addition to their college studies. But I think in addition to that, there seems to be a denial that I've observed across the spectrum of the fact that the growing populations in this country in general are not necessarily the non-diverse populations. I mean, if we look at the numbers just from census data of the growth or the projected growth of the Latino population in this country over the next 20, 50, 100 years, we are going to have to be able to cater to that population in a way that has not been the traditional way of catering to the original college-going population in this country. I think there is some denial of that going on.
But I guess the real question that I have is how much of this is just a shared governance problem within our institutions? So there is the executive team within the institution, there's the faculty who have to help students succeed. There is the board that has to sort of uphold the efforts of the president in trying to help students succeed. And so across the board, we have shared governance issues. And I wonder how much of that gets in the way of student success in general, but specifically for diverse populations that are not well understood.
I'll jump in there if I can answer that, and thank you for that question. At Trinity, not only do we have a traditional women's college, if you will, but we also have a large adult education program. However, I'm using terms that we actually don't use on campus. We don't refer to our students by any age-based language at all, and our students are all post-traditional. Whether a student is 17 or 47, there are students. And frankly, most of them are all supporting families and working and doing all the kinds of things that we think of adults doing. You know, I think for very, very traditional elite liberal arts colleges, there was a time in America when the idea of adult education was new and shocking and perhaps posed a governance problem. I think the number of institutions who have a governance problem around this is actually really pretty tiny right now. I think the idea of a highly diverse student population with a lot of students who are working, a lot of students who are older, is the mainstream of higher ed. You know, I mean, the Department of Ed statistics show us that about 75% of all college students have at least one non-traditional characteristic, if not more. It's huge. What is it? More than 25% of students are parents today, and so on and so on. So the idea that students are very different from that old idyllic, you know, 18-year-old where mom and dad pays the bill living on campus. The number of residential students, I think, is around 15% of the population. Yep. I mean, that old model is dying, and this new population is burgeoning. Now, the other thing that's happening on even the most traditional campuses is the decline in enrollment is driving everybody to look at the potential student populations in a very different way. And so some are catching up where others have been for a very long time. The real challenge is not whether faculties and boards accept the idea of changing students. I think the real challenge comes up in Michael's report, which is whether we can get the curricula aligned with the occupational needs and the workforce needs of the future. That's where shared governance and the faculty fights are more likely to come in than any notion that this, that, or the other student population is unwelcome here. Are we willing to, for example, we went through this with my own faculty about 5 years ago, to accept the idea that a degree for an occupational therapy associate has any place in a liberal arts college? Well, yes, it does. And in fact, it's a very scientific degree, and it's driving a whole new wave in healthcare. But it took the history faculty a little while to wrap their brains around the idea that we were actually giving associate degrees. And this whole idea of what is the credential we offer, in what disciplinary fields, and are the disciplinary fields valid, is a whole new idea. One of the things that many colleges are shocked by when they start going outside of traditional liberal arts is how rigorous specialized accreditation is in the professional programs. And liberal arts faculties tend to look at other professional programs as somehow being less than, when in fact they are more than, and they're extremely rigorous, and they tend to lift the intellectual tone and quality of a campus. This is new. It requires boards and presidents to be forthright about it, but I think the shared governance piece should not be allowed to take a larger share of the air in the room than it deserves. Most institutions have to change, and everybody's moving there.
I totally agree. However, I'm still a bit dismayed that there is such reluctance from many institutions around considering the full value of someone who, for example, comes with decades of significant and substantive military experience, and considering what that portfolio of experience should be valued at or worth when presented at a particular institution, or someone who has received considerable not just on-the-job training, but training from an academy supported from his or her employer. And it is not even really kind of reviewed for any real significant credit. And so, to your point, we have a lot of work to do in
Experiential
terms
learning,
of our
sure,
partnerships.
absolutely.
But I also wanted to just point out that we have other stakeholders that have to be influenced besides those who reside on college and university campuses, such as policymakers who perhaps went to college in very traditional ways and still have that mindset, or whose children still go to college in very traditional ways. So they say, well, my son's roommate had this experience, right? And so most students don't go to college in that way or pursue a credential in that way. Many employers still recruit from a very specific set of institutions, and we have to broaden their thinking around where good students can be found. And so I'm thinking about kind of the broad kind of breadth of institutions that we want others to consider when they are thinking about high quality students and high quality credentials and high quality students.
Thank you. We'll get you, and then we'll
Okay.
go to the next.
So I just want to add, I mean, because it unpacks complexity and it adds to what Danette said. So many folks will know that ACE has historically, for many years, reviewed military occupations and training to award college credit, and also we do it for corporate training. Now, the primary recipients, when we create transcripts, and the institution can then review the transcripts and decide how it wants to accept the credit. Those transcripts primarily go to very specific institutions, degree completion institutions, whose business model is built on accepting those types of learners. As a scale challenge to this issue that Deb asked, it's like, if where we are is a place where you need a broader set of institutions beyond those types of institutions whose business model is built to accept those credits, how does what the historic diversity of American higher education has been as a system matter begin to expand so that way more institutions get that? Because it's such a really interesting paradox, right? The majority of institutions that accept those credits are institutions whose financial model is based on those types of students coming to them. So you're not asking them to do something that's against their financial model. And there's a tension, hopefully a generative tension, between the public policy imperative and how it frames the world in which institutions accept those credits. But if we're at a place where we need more institutions to accept those credits, how do we get to a place where the financials incentives, you're meeting social purposes while also not asking the institutions to do something that doesn't make any financial sense at all to them?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Greg Sheckman. I'm with the University of Central Florida, so thank you, Louis, for the shout out there. And
You can pay me later.
yes, and actually, I want to talk to you later about the military credit, because I think we are one of the institutions that should probably take a harder look at accepting those transcripts. I also was a commissioner and served under Danette, so Lumina's gain is Maryland's loss, but we know that. And John King pilfered Andrew Nichols from our MX staff as well, so he's serving at Trust very well as your director of research. You, Dr. King, you made the point about poverty, and we should remember that the Higher Ed Act came out of LBJ's war on poverty. And I understand why the attainment agenda in the report is focused on disaggregating by race and ethnicity. But when I look at, like Lumina's report on Stronger Nation, and I look at census data, and I look at post-secondary attainment and poverty rates by counties, the strength of the argument is really looking at this on a socioeconomic basis as much as by race and ethnicity, because it's really in those counties where the poverty rate is the highest, where the post-secondary attainment rate is the lowest. And as you pointed out, higher education is the biggest driver of socioeconomic mobility. So should we, I guess in the context of the Higher Ed Act reauthorization, which is hopefully going to happen this year, and we can punt to next year and have a more thoughtful version, look at that key driver, really, which was the war on poverty, and looking at how to move socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, no,
No.
Okay,
Go
all
ahead.
right. Yeah, I think it's, yes, we should be looking at social class. But we also should be looking at race, okay? It's not either or. Sometimes you can address the issue thinking about social class, but after you've done it, if you haven't paid attention to the race, gender difference, you'll get what you worked on, and you might not have the the diversity that you need and want.
Yeah, I agree with Michael completely. And the thing I would add is that there are particular problems that impact students of color that we need to look at both at the institutional level and at the state policy level. So an institutional example, we did a study at Ed Trust looking at different institutions comparing their graduation rates for African American students. We did a similar report for Latino students. You know, Patricia doesn't take enough credit for this. Institutions have one of two mindsets about their diversity on their campus. There are some institutions that have the mindset, our graduation rate is low, but look at who we serve. Look at all these, I mean, we have African American students, we have Latino students, we have veterans, we have students who are working, we have a lot of low-income women. I mean, what can you expect, right? That's you know, we hear this in K-12, we hear this in higher ed. On the other hand, what leaders like Patricia do is say, what we expect is going to help shape our outcomes. And so our job as an institution is figure out, given the challenges our students face, what are we going to do to help them succeed? So you take a place like UC Riverside. UC Riverside has a higher graduation rate for African American students than peer institutions. Other institutions, same size, same demographics. What is it that UC Riverside does differently? Well, one of the things they do differently is they've been very intentional at hiring diverse faculty, so that students of color see on the campus educators that look like them, right? Every one of us has heard in this room, heard a student say to us, I know I can do it because I see this other person who looks like me, and I see Danette, and I know she did it, so I know I can do it, right? That's powerful. So we miss that if we only look at income. We miss that institutional decision-making, and at the state policy level, we have to acknowledge that MSIs are consistently underfunded relative to peer institutions, even serving demographically similar populations in terms of socioeconomics. It's true in K-12, it's also true in higher ed, right? There are these gaps. They are deeply ingrained in our institutional history, right? There's a reason why HBCUs, for example, in states were systematically underfunded. Goes back to, right, in slavery time, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read. You can draw a straight line from that to why some HBCUs have never gotten the adequate level of funding that they should from their state. Same historical problem. So we have to acknowledge that, and then we have to do something about it.
We are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask that you just give your question really quickly, and then maybe we can just wrap them all up. Go ahead.
This is kind of to Danette, but I hope and suspect that others of you have the same experiences. I wondered if you could talk about the importance of partnerships, particularly in communities, around sustainability and success of this. Very quickly, I'm the new incoming president for the Asian Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund. And though we got good news today, we'd certainly highlight that if you disaggregate the data, our students, who are among one of the fastest growing populations, but also living at some of the lowest poverty rates in the United States as well. I just am interested, and I know kind of a softball because I know we live in talent hubs, but I think it's very important to think about the ways that community partnerships can elevate and think and help think about systemic change for these issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think that someone on the panel mentioned communities earlier, but we think that communities are very important partners. We've talked a lot about the federal government, states, institutions, and we've heard from many of our state policy partners in particular that they've done all that they can do at the state level. You know, they've pushed all the policy levers that they can in order to get any additional traction on the post-secondary attainment front, particularly when it comes to narrowing these really persistent equity gaps, that they have to bring this work to a community level. And align the state policy work with individual communities. And sometimes, in fact, there isn't a lot happening at the state level. We still have some states that have not yet set a goal. We have some states that are performing very well when you look at the data in the aggregate, and the new EdTrust report shows that. But when you disaggregate that data, there are significant gaps by race and ethnicity. And when you look across institutions in the state, there are different levels of performance. And so we believe that community partners are essential, and a lot of times what's happening at the community can help to spur more action at the state level. So thank you. And we support communities all across the country. We call them talent hubs, and we believe in employers, communities, post-secondary institutions, that they can come together and really help to move the needle.
Last question.
Hi, my name is Robin Entz. I'm with the National Urban League. Michael, thank you very much for acknowledging what is a valuable partnership with ETS. And Dr. King, just to go a little beyond what you talked about as far as HBCUs and the fact that they've historically served marginalized communities. A few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, we, National Urban League, in partnership with the Education Trust, ETS, held a national convening of HBCU presidents and 3 national partner organizations, the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, NAFAO, and UNCF, to talk about the Higher Education Act. What came out of that was the fact that HBCUs for centuries have been effectively educating people who are undereducated, under-resourced, and under-supported. And that what's happening now is with the challenges and changes that are coming with Pell Grant funding, with the lack of funding for infrastructure, with states decreasing funding to HBCUs, those models of excellence are being threatened. I bring this up and would love to hear your feedback. As I was listening to the presentation today, I'm thinking to myself, we're working to figure out how to solve the challenge of educating 24-year-olds and up. HBCUs have been doing that since the late 1800s, educating people who haven't had the necessary education they needed to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, etc. How can HBCUs, in their models and approaches of comprehensive, intrusive support to young people and older people who need the support, how can those models be held up to answer this question?
Thank you.
Right, thanks.
Anybody want to take that?
Go. I'll
Mr.
follow. No,
Secretary.
I'll follow you.
I think it's a fascinating question, and one that I often wrestle with myself. I happen to be on the board of an HBCU and have really been pushing my own university to consider how we can better serve older students. Quite frankly, I think that we are still too much in the model of serving primarily students right out of high school and into college, and that we need to expand our thinking around serving students who have some college but no degree. I think that many HBCUs have to figure out where they are going to start. They have to, in some instances, still get on board with distance education, still get on board with competency-based education, prior learning. And so in order to best serve adult students, they have to be willing to consider the strategies that are going to best serve adult students, not staying open only from 9 to 5. Being able to provide effective distance education and faculty who are able to teach distance education effectively, not just having a blackboard site. And so these are things I think the most innovative presidents are doing. Secondly, the boards have to be open to providing presidents with the space to try these more innovative strategies. And so we also mentioned the role of boards, and sometimes it takes time for presidents to develop the changes necessary. And I think that our HBCU boards could give some of the presidents a bit more time. I'll stop there.
The other thing I would add is, there's no substitute for federal and state investment, right? And so I worry sometimes that, Danette's point about boards is very, very, very true. And I worry sometimes, a new president comes in, the board says, so glad you're here. We need you to, in your fundraising, be so effective that you make up for the last 300 years of inequity, and make sure you do it by next year, right? And then when that doesn't happen, the board says, I thought you were a great fundraiser. How come you haven't solved this? Right? So part of the challenge is you need the federal government to make a meaningful investment in MSIs and HBCUs in particular, but also in the support for low-income students so that they're able to go to school successfully, right? You need states to fulfill their responsibility to their in-state institutions. And there's litigation in many states around this because you have, again, decades of intentional underinvestment in these institutions. And then we ought to set aside resources to allow some of the innovation that Danette is describing. One of the challenges for under-resourced institutions is if you're barely able to keep the lights on, you don't have a lot of resources to innovate, to be flexible, to try new things. One of the things we proposed in the Obama administration was an innovation fund specifically for MSIs and HBCUs to create some of the flexibility that would allow folks to create new partnerships with employers, to introduce some of the student supports that other institutions are using successfully around the country that require upfront investment. So we need to build the political will to make those investments. But you can be sure if we're going to close these attainment gaps, MSIs, HBCUs will be overrepresented in closing those attainment gaps if we're ever going to close them.
Didn't you all enjoy this panel? Let's give them a round of applause. Let's thank Dr. Michael Nettles for bringing us together so that we could discuss this data, and I'm sure that we'll be having this conversation again very soon. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.